Hello from London. This is the Somewhere on Earth podcast, and it is Tuesday, the 3rd of September. And with us today for a bit of experting is our esteemed editor, Ania Lichtarowicz. Yes, indeed. Ania, nice to have you on this side of the glass, as it were. How are things?
They are good. It's nice to be here. We are all well.
Good to hear it. So, just before we jump into the main part of the podcast then, there's a bit of interest around ID cards in Poland and why people are kind of blocking their personal ID numbers. What the heck is going on?
So yeah, there's quite a lot of interest in this, and I'm quite interested in this because my husband has a personal identification number, as do my children. It's called a PESEL, and everybody who is a Polish citizen or a resident, temporary or permanent, has one of these national ID numbers. Now, the country's digital ministry is asking people to go online and to block their numbers, because since November 2023, all financial institutions have to check your PESEL status as part of any application process. So if you want a loan, if you want a mortgage, even bank transfers of sums above the minimum wage, that's €3,000, need to have this further financial check. And so the Polish Digital Ministry wants everyone to block their PESEL because they say it's the easiest way to reduce the risk of cyber fraud. Now, 4.5 million people have already done this. It's not going to impact anything like your voting rights, so you can still register to vote. You can request official documents even if the number is blocked. However, if you do need to make a financial application to borrow some money, for instance, or to make a big bank transfer for a big transaction, you can change it back, the status of it. You can unblock it at any point. And the way you do this is either on the government website, via an app called M-Obywatel, which translates to M-Citizen. That's the M-Citizen app. Or you can do it in a government office. They are, obviously, the Digital Ministry is encouraging people to do it on the app. So if you are in Poland, just do check that out, have a look, because it could mean that if anybody is trying to defraud you, or if there's been some kind of data leak and that number is out there, it will give you another wall of protection.
That's a fascinating glimpse. Thank you, Anya, and I like your personal and family insight into that too. All right, let's jump in. And coming up today, we're looking at batteries that are the width of a human hair today. Yes, we'll be finding out how they made such tiny power packs and why we need them. Also in this podcast, reactions to our Duchenne muscular dystrophy special with the excellent Eli Crosley. Remember him? We'll get some reaction to that and that massive Windows internet outage from a few weeks ago. Indeed, yes, we are hearing your comments as we delve into the mailbag. Now, hang on, this isn't the 1980s anymore. Maybe I should say delving into our inbox and the socials. Much more up to date. All right, it's all going on here on the Somewhere on Earth podcast. First then, to some big ideas in the very small world of micro and even nano robotics. We're talking about machines so small they can move around the very cells within our body to do repairs or deliver drugs to very specific places. We've talked about tiny robotics before, but I must admit I'd never really stopped to think about how these things actually get the power they need. Well, step forward, Michael Strano and colleagues at MIT. Michael is the Carbon P. Dubs Professor of Chemical Engineering at MIT, and he's led the research just published into a battery the width of a human hair. And for those that love all things units related, here we go. A micron, because you might need this to get through this interview, right? A micron, just to remind everybody, is 1,000th of a millimetre, and a nanometre is 1,000th the size of that. Here's Michael.
The battery itself is a thin layer that can be as small as the size of a cell, so 10 microns by 10 microns, and as thick as you want. It can be from a nanometer thickness to a micron. It's meant to hold energy to power a very small, what we call a micro robot, which is a device the size of a living human cell that can perform different functions.
Yeah, so I think I read one set of dimensions that said that in a particular configuration, the battery can be zero point 0.1 millimeters long and something like 0.002 millimeters thick. So,
Right.
small.
For your listeners, if they want to think about the thickness of their hair, so if they look at the cross section of their hair, imagine a device that's about that thick. So the battery can go inside of that.
And the idea is to power these tiny robots. So people should abandon any thoughts of robots that look like anything you might see in a car factory, for instance. These are very different. The size of a cell, you were saying.
Well, the goal is to bring sensors and electronics and motion to regions that are not accessible now. So imagine if you wanted to detect or do surgery inside the human body or inside of a pipeline or piping system. Think about all of the applications where you'd like to get tools inside of a small space. So that's the goal of this area called micro robotics.
Because the way I often think about these kinds of very small robots is that they take energy from the environment. They're so small that they can, for instance, just take a little bit of heat energy or something like that, and that'll be enough to power them. So why are you going to the trouble of developing a whole, I nearly said whole big battery, but a whole battery?
It's a misconception that you can make a robot very small and just take power the same way you can with a children's toy. There's a threshold or a limit below which energy becomes very, very punishing. So meaning that there's just not enough energy to do the types of things that you want. This is not intuitive. You really have to do the math. But when a robot gets around the size of the thickness of your hair and smaller, engineers like myself, we find there's not enough energy to do anything. I mean, all of a sudden, imagine an electric car that can only have 5% of its charge, or a gasoline engine that only has maybe 100 milliliters. You have to start to think about what can you do with a very small amount of energy. So that has limited what engineers like myself can do. It's the opposite of what you think. If you have a children's toy, you take for granted you can plug it in. There's a rechargeable battery. There's plenty of energy to do what you want. Below a certain size, the opposite is true. You never have enough energy, and that falls right out of the math.
Incredible, and it shows that you really are working at the frontiers of what's possible in tiny robotics and indeed small energy storage. This battery itself, you called it a zinc air battery, so clearly zinc comes into it. I think there's a bit of platinum in there as well. So tell us a little bit about the makeup of the battery.
Well, we decided to use zinc because it's actually a nutrient in the human body. There's a portion of the field that's thinking very much about medicine. Think about it's been a long-standing goal. Could you make a robotic device that could go inside the body and address medical problems there? I'll explain for your listeners the concept of an air battery because it's not intuitive and they're not commercial yet. But there are researchers working on a battery like you would have in your phone or in your laptop that takes some of its energy from the environment. So if your battery can breathe air, it means some of the chemical energy comes from the environment, and that means the battery can hold more energy than a regular battery can. That's called an air-breathing battery. It uses oxygen as part of the chemical energy. So it's a clever idea. The field hasn't gotten large batteries to work like that yet, but there's a big advantage, right? Because instead of being limited by all the energy inside of a battery, you can offload some of the energy requirement to the surroundings.
Yeah, so there's stuff out there in the surroundings already that you can just pull together with a bit of chemistry within the battery and a combination of metals and then pull some energy out of it. Is that it?
So that's how our zinc micro battery works. It uses oxygen and water from the surroundings to partly power the battery. The other part comes from the zinc, and that means we can pack more energy into a very small volume. That's absolutely critical for this kind of problem. You never have enough energy to do what you want, so it's critically important to get as much energy into the device as possible.
How far have you managed to get with this research? So is this a lab demo that you have there at MIT, or are we talking about something that you've modeled on the computer? Where are we at?
My lab, and if I can be presumptuous, I'll speak for the whole field. We've made modest progress. I would say we're making the Legos, the building blocks that go into robots. So where the field is, there are researchers that have made grippers. They've made little tiny legs that can move and crawl. We've made a battery. Others have made sensors. So we're building the parts, and it's an exciting part of the field now. It's an exciting time because we're just starting to assemble those together to make very simple robots, things that can detect and measure, remember that they've measured something, can flow or move in a flow stream. And so you're seeing the start of a field, but I think that's where we are now. We're building the different Legos that can be put together to make a device.
Because when I think of a robot, you think of a device that interacts with the world in some way. You know, it might have an actuator, as engineers call it. In other words, like a little motor that makes things move. It can sense its environment. You know, it can convert one thing from another thing. The kind of things that robots do at the macro, if you like, real world scale. It sounds as if you're achieving similar functions, but at this cellular level, this micro or even maybe nano level. It's incredible.
Yes, so actuation, that's a fancy word for a device that moves. You can think of your arm. It takes glucose and it turns it into motion. So engineers call that an actuator. It causes an action. And so in the microrobotics field, we've made small parts that can move. They can take in voltage or a fuel and they can move. Actuation turns out to be very hard. Gripping is hard even for macro robotics. I ask my colleagues at MIT what the progress is in robots that can do manipulation tasks. So they say we're still a few years out from a robot that can fold a towel. These are very complex tasks. If you think of your human hand is a very sophisticated device. So it's even worse at the micro scale. However, we've made progress. We can make small micro things grab and release, and this is work of my colleagues, and the battery that we've demonstrated can provide the energy for things like that.
And it shows how crucial this is then. So it's all very well having one of these micro robots that, for instance, can move a molecule around within the body, but if it can't get any power, you don't have a robot, do you? So this work really matters.
It's really central. So, and I've said before, you can build a robot around a core energy source. But without that energy source, you're really stuck. There's two kinds of robots that you can think of. We're working on devices that have their own energy. They bring their energy along with them. There's another concept that I call a marionette. Your listeners may be familiar with puppets that are manipulated on a string. So in the literature, in the field, we also have people working on these marionette kind of robots, where you have a small device, but it's tethered in some way. It gets energy and it gets the thinking from outside of the robot. And those are a bit more sophisticated. If you can find a way to get to sort of beam power to the device and control it, maybe with a magnetic field or by moving light around, you can do a bit more. And that's very promising research, but there are a whole set of problems where you can't get that tether. You can't beam that energy in effectively. So the field is going to need both, and it's going to be useful to have a robot that can bring its own energy to the environment where you want to accomplish your task.
So what kind of tasks do you have in mind then? What kind of uses?
We are, like others in the field, we're looking at the human body. So can you do surgical tasks in the human body without having to cut open tissue? This could make surgery dramatically cheaper, safer for humans. You could go through different orifices. In medicine, they're called luminal spaces. And we're also looking at monitoring infrastructure for the environment. Think of gas pipelines. Right now, in the United States and around the world, we pump natural gas through a pipeline, but that methane, primarily methane, leaks out, and it's a very potent greenhouse gas. It's a worse greenhouse gas than CO2, than carbon dioxide. So we would like to be able to put little robotic probes that can just flow through the pipeline, miles and miles of pipeline, and detect leaks. So we've made some progress towards that. And your listeners can think of these tasks where, can you get electronics into a very small space? Can you get it into machinery to diagnose if something's working or not? So the idea is to get something small enough to go into a crack or a crevice and then sense, report, actuate, maybe do something, maybe retrieve So these are the kind of things that we're thinking about.
Michael Strano there with a lot to think about. So, Ania Lichtarowicz, there's a lot to think about there, isn't there? What an exciting story.
Yes, this is very, very exciting, Gareth. I mean, imagine surgery, especially explorative surgery, being a thing of the past. I'm thinking of these kind of quite mundane, routine, but very unpleasant procedures. So endoscopies and colonoscopies, having a tube stuck down your throat and into your stomach to check that you haven't got ulcers, for instance, or cancer. A colonoscopy, well, that is, the other side of your body, isn't it? With a tube and a camera going up basically through your bum and into your intestine to, again, check the health of that. Very important for things like polyps, which are these little things that grow inside your intestine and can cause cancer. So it's important to make sure that if there are any little ones that they get removed. It's also great for delivering drugs to the right part of the body. So you reduce the amount of drug you need. It's a more effective treatment, but also you have fewer side effects. However, can you hear my however coming, Gareth?
Yeah, here it comes.
Yeah, there are ethical concerns. They need to be addressed, and certainly Michael and his team at MIT are doing this. Have you ever been for an MRI scan, Gareth?
I have. They're very noisy, aren't they, MRIs?
They are incredibly noisy. You have to wear headphones, but there is also a very long questionnaire before you go in to answer. So questions that are asked on there are things like, do you have a pacemaker? Or have you ever had a capsule endoscopy? So that's actually when you swallow a rather large tablet which goes through your entire digestive tract, taking thousands and thousands of photos along the way. Now, this is important because the MRI itself, the scan itself, can have an impact on the pacemaker. So those are checked before you go in and after you've come out to make sure that it's all working properly. And the capsule, now that should come out through your digestive system, so it should come out in your feces. But if it hasn't, that could cause actually very serious damage to your digestive tract during an MRI scan. So, we're not quite sure how these robots will respond and react. So it's incredibly important that they are always tracked. The doctor needs to know where they are in the body. Number one, to know that it's got to the right part to deliver a drug, for instance. But also, they've got to be able to be retrieved at any time as well. So they need to keep an eye as to where they are. We don't know what side effects these robots could have and what would happen if they're lost. So could they cause damage later is certainly a question that needs to be addressed before they come anywhere near us.
Yeah, I think that's so important as well, because it's great, and I love doing this on podcasts to talk about the really exciting aspects of the research, to think about how forward thinking it all is, but at the same time a little bit of a in fact that however I think
yeah.
is important to have with some of these stories and just putting those into context.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you, Ania. And I think it's great that we can get so excited about these genuinely really amazing technology stories, but it's just good to get those little kind of yes buts at the end, a bit of context and a bit of a reality check as well. So, Ania, thank you. Speaking of reality checks, shall we hear from our lovely listeners, Ania?
I think we should. We haven't heard from them for a while.
Shall we do that? Absolutely. Let's hear then from Jason Snowden, who says, I really enjoyed the latest podcast. This is a while back, but the latest podcast, as it was back then, about Eli Crosley and Duchenne UK. It'd be good to hear more about the issue with actuators and exoskeletons. I remember not long enough ago, I realised the Iron Man suit would not work as shown in films. I wonder if neural implant is the way to go. So, Jason, there, it's interesting, isn't it? It's whether kind of neural enhancement perhaps needs to get more of a look in rather than all the exoskeleton stuff, which tends to get a lot of attention, doesn't it? Because
it does,
I suppose these things are very visual and they get a lot of coverage on the telly because they're visual. Of course, there already are neural implants, and you could probably argue that something like a retinal implant or some kind of help with your hearing, one of those kinds of implants, is it is going into the brain effectively, or parts of the brain, But Jason really asking a very good question there about neural enhancement as well as the physical enhancement.
I always have a slight reservation though with this, Gareth, because I kind of think of my mum's hearing aids, and she bought them 2 years ago, and obviously the company she bought them from are pushing, saying, "Oh, you need new ones. These ones now do this, and these ones now do this," and you do wonder how quickly the technology improves. And it's one thing saying, okay, I'll upgrade my hearing aids, which are external, and just, yes, you have to spend quite a bit of money, but it doesn't really impact you physically. Having a neural impact, what are you going to do? Change it after 2 years? It's going to be... and also, we also have to remember that the Iron Man suit from Marvel probably wasn't going to work. I've just seen the latest Marvel, and certainly some of the things that were happening in there were never going to happen in real life. But,
yeah, not for a while.
Not for a while, indeedy.
No, sure. All right. But thank you for that one, Jason. Good one. Floyd Kennedy heard us talking about the aftermath of that CrowdStrike outage. And this was back, was it earlier in August? I think there was this whole shenanigans where Windows-based systems around the world, I'm sure you remember it must have happened to you, dear listener, or quite possibly did, or at least you were affected by it. It got the blue screen of death, and it caused all kinds of disruption. And when we talked about it, I think it was either later that week or a week later, but Microsoft had just done like an initial report into all this. But so it wasn't as if we did particularly extensive coverage, but it was good to just get that check-in with Microsoft's initial response to the whole issue. And Floyd says full marks to Gareth for his constraint in the report of the CrowdStrike mishap, and extra full marks to Ania for the balanced volume throughout. So balanced volume, says Floyd, so full marks to you, Ania. I assume meaning just the sound levels.
Well, I have to say it's the sound levels. I think that was Keziah that week. I think it was, from what I remember, not me. And I apologise to people because I know when I edit the show that I do have a tendency to put really loud levels of music on it. But that's my independent radio background, where obviously we were taught that a jingle kind of wakes everybody up.
A bit too much.
Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Oh my goodness me. What was that? So I fully admit that my style of editing is a bit... how can one put it? Perhaps for a very young audience, that's definitely something that, it's a bit of my bad. So I have taken that into account. I'm trying to claw it back. So, but do keep telling me if I'm, if I've not done it right.
Oh, well, that's very gracious of you, Ania, to attribute that praise, as it should be, to Keziah, who was doing those lovely sound levels that Floyd praised us over. Must admit, if it was me, I'd probably just take the praise, but no, not really. I'm very honest. And actually, on the subject of sound levels, a friend of mine who listens said that he found some of the music beds a bit loud, and his perspective is quite interesting because he wears hearing aids. So not only did he find it a bit like, it's a bit difficult to hear the speech over the music, I think he actually struggled with it a bit, just for people who wear hearing aids, that if the music beds are too loud, it's quite difficult for them. So it was an interesting perspective. So thank you for that. And look, I make other podcasts and do bits of mixing myself. So this isn't just about you, Ania, and your mixing, but indeed mine. I'm learning from that too, because I'm
absolutely
sure I have a tendency as well to bump the music up a little bit, and it's tricky. You got to. It's very hard to know. Oh, I won't get too far into the weeds here, but I will often do a rough cut of a podcast and I'll mix the music and then come back to it a bit later and think, the music's like a bit too quiet. And then I'll go and bump the music up again and then listen to it later and think, it's too high now. It's very difficult. So I do take my hat off to people like Keziah, who's our professional sound engineer, or one of them over at Lanson's Team Varna, who just seem to have that instinct for what works when people download this stuff and listen to it.
Indeed, Keziah and the lovely Dylan, who's done quite a few recently, and Cal and Stevie before them. So we are very grateful to them, and I will keep drawing it back, I promise.
Yeah, oh, there we are. Right. So, Floyd, thank you very much indeed for that. And Floyd then goes back to the subject of the CrowdStrike outage and says how anyone is even surprised that a tech glitch could bring down major elements of the internet is beyond me. So, yes, I think that's a good point. It's especially this kind of semi-monopoly. Can you have a semi-monopoly? Anyway, this quasi-monopolistic situation where so much of the world's commerce systems and indeed personal computers are pretty much using the same software, so it's that kind of single point of failure, isn't it? Which
it
is not
it
great.
is. I mean, I think quite a few people were saying, well, if it was on Linux it wouldn't have happened, but something could have happened to that as well. So, and I love the way Pete described it, I think, in the show, which is, that some of it's held together by pieces of string while other bits of it are, built very robustly. So it is a bit of a mismatch out there, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. Another subject, a couple of listeners agreeing about how annoying it is that some services that we have to use these days force you to save to the cloud rather than just having your documents locally on your laptop or on your PC or whatever.
I just want my documents on my things, yeah? That's what I want it on. I don't want it in the cloud. It's, something always goes wrong, all this automatic saving, etc., etc. I have dyslexia. It really confuses me. I just prefer it that way, that it's on my space, not someone else's.
You know where you are with it. Yeah. Or maybe the best of both worlds, because quite a few years ago now, one of our listeners back in the Digital Planet days sent me an invitation to Dropbox, which nobody had heard of at the time. And I looked into it and thought, oh, this is handy. And it does give you that best of both worlds situation. So you just have your normal file structure on your hard drive, on your actual machine, sitting in front of you, but it's all synchronized to like the parallel online folder through the cloud in Dropbox. And of course, since then, loads of other services have come in doing a similar thing. And through the Microsoft 365 kind of Office suite, you can do all that kind of stuff, and OneDrive. So there are lots of ways of doing it. So that would be a happy medium to me, that you just you've got it on your hard drive, but then everything synchronizes. So then when you close your laptop and go and start work on another computer, everything's just synchronized onto that computer.
Yep.
So that's what I think about that, for what it's worth, which probably isn't very much.
Now let's move on to a bit of a complaint.
Oh, yes.
So this is...
Do you want to read this one out?
I will read this one out. This came into our emails, hello@somewhereonearth.co. So, hello team, from Alex in Central Kenya. I've been following you around from the good old days of DP to the sad ending of the Gareth and Bill cast to here. I like how you highlight tech stories that would otherwise fly under, over, through, beyond, whatever radar there is. However, I am disappointed in the unexpected ads which pop up when an expert is in the middle of a sentence. I believe you can do better. Overall, great work, guys. Wouldn't we like to have Bill in here? So we'll get your questions into Bill. We'll try and get him into a show. But let me quickly, Gareth, explain the adverts. So as many of you know, we have left the safe haven of the BBC, and we have to finance this podcast. And one way is through these unexpected ads that are added by our podcasting platform. That's our hosting platform. And that's all done by AI. Now, it's very difficult to try and change it. You can change it a little bit, but these adverts are put in automatically, and they also change. So the subscription version, we take them off there, obviously, because you guys are very kindly paying $10 a month to listen to the extra bits, and you shouldn't have adverts in those. But, it does change where these adverts go, and I can check and I can have a look, and I do try and make sure that they are in a place where it isn't mid-sentence, but sometimes you just cannot change them. So I do apologise if they do interrupt your listening, but we do have to have financial support from somewhere. Good journalism costs, and I hope we're doing some good journalism. And that's the way in this big wide world outside public broadcasting.
Yes, if only we had a publicly funded license fee to keep us on air, but alas not. So the adverts it is, and I have mixed feelings when I hear them. So when I'm playing the podcast back and one of these ads crashes in, usually it seems to be at the end of one of my intros and then just before the start of the item. It's like, yeah, well, thanks for completely screwing up the kind of mood that I set there and my beautifully honed intro. dear AI. So it's a bit mixed feelings, but then I'm also thinking, good, that's making us some money, so that makes me happier.
Not very much, but yeah,
Then
every download helps.
it does. And then my other mixed feeling is that with all this talk of artificial intelligence and machine learning, there is still a place for humanoid life forms, like Ania, for instance, who can sit there and edit and use their human judgment and their artistic temperament to craft audio in a way that is sympathetic, that is seamless, that is beautiful. And evidently, AI hasn't learned to do that yet. So you're safe for the time being, Ania. That's all I'm saying.
Oh, thanks. Although I am tempted to just put out one episode that's been completely edited by AI and see what everyone thinks.
Well, that'd be depressing if Floyd writes in saying, "Oh, it was a beautifully mixed episode this time. Oh, it was so slick. Everything really worked. Ania, well done. It's your best work."
Let's not risk it then.
Maybe not. Oh goodness! Right, there we are. Is that quite enough for now? Then
I think
Producer
so.
Ania?
Yeah. Listen, let's just get on to the podcast extra. I'm not going to say anything, I don't think, in that podcast extra, because we're going to have nanotechnology, biotechnology, molecular biology, glowing plants. I believe spinach that sends emails. Detects explosives.
And no ads.
And no ads. Well, hey, worth it just for that.
What's not to love? So see you over there for the subscription if you're coming over for that. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. And thank you from the whole team here. I'm sure you know us by now. I'm Gareth. She's Ania. We have production manager Liz Tui, and we usually at Lanson's team Farner, but we're not today. But we will be again. All right. Speak to you soon, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.